Crimes against humanity. It's a phrase you hear a lot, right? It sounds incredibly serious. But what does it actually mean in a court of law? Well, today, we're going to trace the story of that very phrase, how it went from just an expression of outrage to one of the most important legal concepts we have for fighting the worst acts imaginable.
Think about this for a second. We've all heard of war crimes, right? Things that happen between nations during a conflict. But what's the word for when a government turns on its own people, when it commits mass murder or torture or persecution against its own citizens? For a very long time, international law just didn't have an answer.
And that was a huge problem. It was this massive blind spot. See, the traditional laws of war just didn't apply. What a government did inside its own borders, especially during peacetime, was seen as its own business. This created a kind of legal black hole, a space where unthinkable things could happen with no path to international justice. So let's go back to the beginning. Before this was a charge you could actually bring against someone, it was just an idea. People were searching for words to describe something truly indescribable. Yeah, this idea didn't just pop up out of thin air. It started as a way for people to condemn something, to express this deep global shock at acts that just felt fundamentally wrong, even if they didn't technically break any international laws at the time. It was a phrase born out of a desperate need to name a unique kind of evil.
And you can literally watch the idea evolve right here. In 1890, an American named George Washington Williams uses it to talk about the horrors happening in the Congo. Then, jumped in 1915, and it's used in a formal accusation by the Allied powers against the Ottoman government. But the real game changer, the moment that turned this from a moral concept into actual solid law, was 1945.
And that brings us to Nuremberg. This is really the story of how the absolute horror of World War II forced the world's hand, creating this urgent, undeniable need for a brand new tool for justice. You have to understand the challenge the prosecutors at Nuremberg were facing. It was just immense. The Holocaust, the systematic murder of millions, was largely carried out by the German state against its own citizens and people in occupied territories. And the truly twisted part? Many of these acts were technically legal under Nazi Germany's own laws. So how on earth do you prosecute that? This was their answer. Article 6 of the Nuremberg Charter. For the very first time, things like murder, extermination, and deportation were legally defined as crimes against humanity. This was nothing short of revolutionary. It meant you could hold individuals accountable for these barbaric acts, no matter what their own country's laws said.
But, and this is a really big but, there was a catch. The way the charter was written, you could only prosecute these crimes if they were connected to the war itself, either to war crimes or crimes against peace. So, back in 1945, a crime against humanity had to be hooked to a war. That blind spot for atrocities committed in peacetime, it wasn't completely gone. Not yet. Okay, so that leads us to the modern definition, because over the next few decades, the law evolved a lot. So what exactly does it take to be a crime against humanity today? This is the key. This is the threshold, and it comes from the Rome Statute, which created the International Criminal Court. We're not talking about random, isolated crimes. For an act to be a crime against humanity, it has to be part of a bigger picture. It has to be either widespread, meaning it's happening on a massive scale, or systematic, meaning it's organized, it's planned, and it has to be aimed at civilians. And to make sure there is as little gray area as possible, the Rome Statute gets super specific. It doesn't just give a vague definition. It lists exactly 11 specific types of acts that can be prosecuted as crimes against humanity, as long as they meet that widespread or systematic test. And here they are. You can see the original crimes from Nuremberg are still here: murder, enslavement. But the list has gotten a lot longer and a lot more detailed. It now explicitly includes things like enforced disappearance, the crime of apartheid, and all forms of sexual violence. It's a list that has been carefully built over decades to reflect the awful reality of how these atrocities are carried out. So we have the definition down, but, a law is only as powerful as the courts that enforce it, and that brings us to the institutions that were built to hold people accountable, the highest courts for the world's worst crimes. Now, this right here is probably the single most important development in the entire story. On the left, Nuremberg. You needed a link to a war. On the right, the modern ICC definition. That link is gone. It's been completely removed. This is a huge deal. It means that, finally,
a state can be held accountable for atrocities against its own people even in times of peace. That legal black hole we talked about, this closed it.
Now, this change didn't just happen overnight. The 1990s were a critical period. The UN set up special, temporary tribunals to prosecute the horrific crimes in the former Yugoslavia and the genocide in Rwanda. These courts became the testing grounds where the law was hammered out and refined, and it was there that the link to armed conflict was decisively broken.
All of that hard work and legal precedent culminated in this, the establishment of the International Criminal Court, the ICC, in 2002. And unlike those temporary tribunals, the ICC is permanent. It's the world's first and only permanent international court that has the power to go after individuals for genocide, war crimes, and, of course, crimes against humanity.
Which brings us right up to the present, because this whole legal framework isn't just sitting in a history book. It's a living, breathing tool that's being used right now to confront atrocities that are happening all over the world.
Take Myanmar, for instance. Investigators from the United Nations have concluded that the military's violent campaign against the Rohingya people, we're talking mass killings, systematic rape, shows the hallmarks of crimes against humanity. It's a similar story when you look at the UN Human Rights Office report on the situation in China's Xinjiang region. It concluded that the scale of the arbitrary detention of Uyghurs and other groups, along with other human rights abuses, could amount to international crimes, specifically crimes against humanity. And in Sudan, the current conflict has led to just countless reports of atrocities. The actions of the Rapid Support Forces, which are allegedly being supplied by the UAE, are now being looked at as potential war crimes and crimes against humanity. It just goes to show how relevant this law is today. So look, we have come a really long way from a time when these horrors didn't even have a legal name. The world has built this incredible legal structure to try and deliver some justice after the fact. We can finally pursue accountability for humanity's worst crimes. But the big question, the one that hangs over all of this, is can the threat of justice actually stop these things from happening in the first place?